This week, we air our ninth pre-recorded segment called Say Easy, Do Hard. Inspired by my co-host, Jason Albuquerque, we discuss defining objectives and key results aligned to business goals. Aligning risk management strategies with organizational objectives is crucial for effectively mitigating threats and fostering sustainable growth. Easier said than done. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Imagine a world where every threat, ransomware, supply chain attacks, zero-day exploits is stopped before it can even begin. ThreatLocker makes that world a reality with a zero-trust approach to cybersecurity. By giving you granular control on every executable that can happen in your environment, ThreatLocker protects your business around the clock. No more guessing, no more gaps. Just rock-solid protection that keeps your operations running smoothly and your data secure. Discover how ThreatLocker's least privilege approach can safeguard your organization against known and unknown threats. Take the first step towards total peace of mind. Visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker today. The threat landscape is constantly evolving, making it nearly impossible for security teams to keep up. That's why so many top companies turn to Tynes, a security orchestration and automation platform built by security practitioners for security practitioners. Tynes empowers analysts and engineers to automate their most repetitive, time-consuming tasks. No coding expertise required, just the flexibility to tailor workflows to your team's exact needs. Ready to break free from the limitations of traditional tools? Learn more at securityweekly.com/Tynes. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 393, recorded April 8th, 2025, but will air on April 28th, 2025 to kick off RSA Conference. I'm your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this interview segment are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque.
Hey, Matt.
Hey,
looking forward to this Say Easy, Do Hard. I love these. You know, obviously, we have a little kinship around that, right? There's so many things out there that it's easy to say, but so hard to put the elbow grease in to get it done. And when this airs, we're just going to be just out of the 2025 NFL Draft, which is the 24th through the 26th. So I can't wait for our next segment to be able to chat about that. But I don't know. I think Cam Ward, Travis Hunter, they're going to be flying out of the gates. They're going to be gone right away.
I think so, yeah. And some others are going to fall a little further than they probably wanted to.
Yeah, no doubt.
Also joining me for this interview segment, my second co-host, Mr. Ben Carr. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, Matt. Good to see you again. Looking forward to having some discussions about some objective setting. This should be interesting. Yeah,
yes. Now, this segment came to us from our guests, which I'll get to in a second. But first, a quick announcement. Identiverse 2025 is returning to Las Vegas June 3rd to 6th. Hear from 250 plus expert speakers and connect with over 3,000 identity security professionals across 4 days of keynotes, breakout sessions, and deep dives into the latest identity security trends. Plus, take part in our hands-on workshops and explore the brand new non-human identity pavilion. Register now and save 25% with code IDV25-Security Weekly by visiting securityweekly.com/IDV 2025. Our guest, who kind of inspired the Say Easy, Do Hard, is Summer Fowler. She is a hockey mom who's a CISO in her spare time. She's in her third CISO role, serving in the capacity at Torque Robotics, which is a self-driving trucking company. Summer teaches cyber governance and metrics, which is how this got inspired, at Carnegie Mellon University's executive education program. And she is the adjunct faculty at both Carnegie Mellon and Duquesne University. With a passion for governance, Summer serves on both nonprofit and for-profit boards, which is how we first met a few years back. Summer, welcome to Business Security Weekly. Welcome back to Business Security Weekly.
Oh, thanks for having me. As Jason noted in the sports realm, I pretend to be a basketball fan during March Madness, so here I am in my Gator green, you know, cheering for Florida last night.
Same.
And by the way, Jason, the NFL draft is going to be in Pittsburgh next year, so you guys can all come visit, and maybe we can do a
Nice.
segment from there.
That'd be awesome.
That would be a lot of fun. I think I told you this summer, my wife's cousin is married to Cam Hayward, who
Yes.
plays for the Steelers. So, yeah.
He just gave a boatload of money, a huge portion, like his bonus of tens of millions of dollars to charity.
Good for
It was
him.
just announced within the past couple of weeks. So he's just an amazing person. So
Yeah, and well,
Good
he won the
family.
Walter Payton Award last year, which was an awesome honor for him. So, yeah, great guy.
yeah.
Yes. All right. So we're going to talk OKRs. And how this started was we interviewed you yesterday for a segment that's going to run tomorrow. This is a pre-record, so the sequence is a little interesting. But as we were talking through a topic, you had mentioned, hey, we could do a discussion around objectives and key results. I said, that would make a great say easy, do hard segment, because I get these requests occasionally on this whole concept of how do you align like business risks and objectives to like corporate goals and objectives, because as we talk about on the show a lot, aligning risk and metrics of risk to company goals is really important, but really hard to do. So I'm like, this is a great say easy, do hard segment. So before we get into like, how do we do it? Like I guess it's more about the importance of this. Like we know it's important, but does everybody really understand the importance of trying to align security risks and security outcomes with business goals and objectives?
I mean, I don't think that understanding is complete. And the reason I say this is we oftentimes, we keep seeing over and over really good security programs that still have failures at helping their organizations to achieve what they need to achieve. And I think it's because there is a lack of alignment. And where does that lack of alignment come from? It's a leadership chain, right? It is the job. That's fundamentally your job as a leader, is to make sure that your team understands what the goals are of the company, so that together you can craft a program that's going to help you get there. That's the most critical thing that you can do. And some of that's going to be some of the business as usual things. And then other times it's going to be innovation. But that alignment, I think, is lacking because it is hard. It's just like you said, we all say it's easy. We're going to do we're going to build out our objectives and key results. And then you come to find out it doesn't actually help align to what the company needs to achieve.
In summary, the do hard part about all of this is getting that alignment from the rest of the C-suite. It's the struggles that we talk about a lot on this show. One of my first CISO roles, the CEO looked at me and said, "Well, aren't you just like insurance?" That was the comment that I got from the CEO of the organization. And right then and there, I realized quickly it was my job
needed to apply for another job.
No, you want to know what? No. To be honest with you, I took that challenge because I said, if I don't put skin in the game, I'm never going to educate these executives. These executives need education into why my role needs to exist. And I spent time with the CEO, spent time with the CFO. I had to make, really tight relationships with them and then help get that influence across the rest of the C-suite in order to start to understand the business. Because if I didn't understand the business, I couldn't put the right metrics in place. I couldn't get the right partnerships with the rest of the business. There's nothing stronger than walking in with another leader to the CEO's office and making a case for security. But in order to do that, you have to get buy-in. You have to get support. And I started right at the top. I went right to the CEO, right to the CFO, and I educated the hell out of them as to why I'm not like insurance. That was the beginning for me, because most organizations look at security still as just a technology problem, not a business initiative, not a business imperative, and not a strategic program. I had to spend probably about close to a year educating, and it paid dividends significantly.
Yeah, and I'll tap off of that and say that when we talk about objectives and key results and kind of coming up with metrics and how we're going to measure a program that aligns to the business, I think a lot of people go to how do we create our own metrics, right? And how do we create metrics for our team? But I do want to highlight, just to kick this off, that I think it's super important that there is some metric that's out there for the rest of the organization that also aligns to security, to tie in like a shared goal, a shared benefit, right? And make it that message from the top that security is important for the business, for a business reason, right? I mean, that metric, that overall goal has to be aligned to the business critically, but there's got to be something there. And I think a lot of organizations miss that, right? It's all about other stuff. It's about shipping product, delivering software, finances, and they miss that there needs to be an overarching thing to kind of set the tone within the org. Summer, do you concur with that?
I completely concur. And, one of the reasons this really jumped out as a topic for me is Matt sent me an older episode where Jim Ralph was being interviewed. And the discussion was, when you first walk in, I think it was 3 things that CISOs do wrong. And one of those things had to do with not having the C-suite align on what the risks to the company are. And so we have to take off our cyber hats, walk in, and understand the actual risks to the business, and then understand where cybersecurity falls in that realm. Because frankly, when we're in the C-suite, cybersecurity is just one of the things we should be concerned with, right? And
It's
so
one risk.
having that alignment of all of the risks then helps us to understand where cybersecurity falls in, because it might contribute to a third-party risk, or it might contribute to a regulatory risk. But that alignment of risk, to me, it totally jumped out of that episode. And I thought, this really ties into what becomes difficult in establishing OKRs.
And so here's one of the challenges I see is most organizations don't have a good enterprise risk management structure that correlates business enterprise operational risk with cyber risk. And so they're almost like completely disconnected. So to get alignment is really, really hard because you're not thinking about it holistically. I mean, do you see that as well, Summer? Because I see it all the time. Like, I talk to CISOs and they're like, yeah, I've got all my cyber risks over here, but then I have to figure out how to integrate them into my enterprise risk management register, and the scales and the values, everything's they're not aligned.
They aren't aligned. Let's just lay that out there. So, for example, at my company, I have cybersecurity, I have IT. I'm now taking on an enterprise risk role. And for a while, I was our interim safety lead. We just hired a chief safety officer who started yesterday. So hallelujah. But so he'll own the safety risks. But when you're measuring cyber risks, that measurement, that stick is different than what you measure safety with. So what we really have to get over is the fact that I'm going to measure the risks differently, and then you have to roll them up and normalize them to the business. And it's so hard to do because it
doesn't
it's
translate at
calibration.
all well. Yeah, it's super hard, right? Like, I've been in those conversations where it's like, well, what's the value of the cyber risk compared to this multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar risk to an enterprise? It doesn't translate, but the likelihood's much higher, and the actual impact can be much greater. Like, it depends. It's hard to functionally put it into numbers that align to the rest of the risks.
It is. And one of the ways that we've gotten better at doing this is, instead of doing the traditional look at, okay, what's my impact versus my likelihood, right? And you know how there's always the X and Y axis that you look at. Yep. We've actually taken X and Y and folded it into Y and said, the Y axis is risk. The X axis is how mature are we at being able to manage this risk. And so now we're looking at, is the risk high or low, and how good are we at, how mature are we at being able to manage it? Because frankly, sometimes it's just the risk is going to remain high, but we're really mature and we're doing the best we can do. And we're not going to move that risk down. We're not going to change the likelihood of something happening. We're not going to change the impact unless we manage it well. So really doing the self-reflection. So
It's the
that's
acceptance
really
of the
how
risk.
we've done it. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so if you have a scale that says, if you have a scale that says, all right, let's look across this in terms of, safety from an impact and a maturity, control maturity, and cyber from an impact and a control maturity, then you can start to normalize things a little bit and say,
Right.
how does that compare to regulation? How does that compare to financial, et cetera?
One
How
of the
much?
ways we've, oh, sorry,
No,
Jason,
no.
I
I
was
was,
going to
I was
say,
just going to add because it's very interesting the way you're
Mhm.
looking at risk and calculating the risk. How much input does the rest of the organization, the C-suite, let's say, your peers, have in that calculation, right? Because a lot of times
Yeah.
what I see is CISOs who walk in the door and they'll define it for the company versus getting
Yeah.
input and having the company help define it with them alongside them.
So the first thing I've done is I've gotten agreement on what the categories are, right? So what do we have as categories of risk? We have 9 right now, right? It's looking across a gamut of things. And then the calculations I actually develop with them. So I'll walk in and say, all right, how do we think? Or even before I get to calculation, I might say, okay, this is a category of risk, but what are all of the actual risks that we're going to measure underneath of this?
Mhm.
And then to say, all right, how do I actually pull all of these together into a score for that category? And that it's so complex, right? And I have to work very closely. First, it's just the C-suite to say, do we agree on the risk categories? Then it's working within their teams to really do the risks themselves and how we're going to do the measurements and the cadence at which we'll do that. So
Yeah,
you really have to work across all levels.
yeah, and I think that's so important because there's nothing worse than getting into a leadership meeting and having two leaders disagree on a metric or a risk or something like that. It's just showing that you're not aligned, right? And at the end of the day, my concern is always that the CISO, because they're not seen as helping drive the business forward, is always going to get poo-pooed, right? All right, fine. It may be a little bit of risk, but the business still needs to operate, right? And that's my
Yeah.
fear. So going in there with consensus and with strength, I think is very, very important.
It's interesting because I've seen a lot of these risk models developed by the big 4 consulting firms, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've looked at a lot of these spreadsheets. And so I actually build software that has tried to map that in to kind of harmonize risks across the board. That's kind of what CyberSync does. But you said something interesting, and I want to play this out because I'm curious whether this resonates or not. Because I'm trying to also think about how to solve this problem in a unique way. When I think about likelihood and impact, we try to quantify that as an annualized loss expectancy, right?
Mhm.
A single value instead of 2, but the 2 axes kind of drive impact, frequency drive the ALE. So you standardize everything as an annualized loss expectancy, right? And you kind of did that a little bit with the combination of the X and Y axis is one axis. And then you think about, well, how mature am I to mitigate that risk? And I was just thinking through it's almost like 3 axes. You have a likelihood, an impact, and a level of maturity. And if you can align the traditional kind of risk methodology that Deloitte or PwC or whoever it is puts in, and then add the 3rd axis, that could be a really interesting way to articulate that concept. But I think the way most people think about it, they love their heat maps, Summer, right? They love their qualitative heat maps. They love the 2-dimensional map. But by itself, it doesn't drive enough insights. And maybe that 3rd dimension could, if you could figure out how to build the Rubik's Cube.
Yeah. Well, and if you think about it from terms of aviation with a 3rd axis, right? That 3rd axis of your maturity is really going to tell you how much turbulence is this plane going to have when something happens. Right. So it really does become a really interesting way of doing it. And you're exactly right. It was a heat map that drove us to combining likelihood and impact into one axis because we definitely wanted to be able to show that maturity.
Right.
And so that is but the 3-dimensional way, if you can start modeling that out, that would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting when you said how much turbulence. It's almost like when I think about impact and when we talk about impact, we're really talking about cost generally, right? It's a cost picture.
Yeah.
Really, impact is more than cost. And so if you think
Mhm.
about that third metric, if you thought about it like more of like impact to the business or how much it causes that turbulence, that's really more what I think a lot of CISOs have struggled to get at, how to explain to the business what the actual problem is, right? And it's been very, very hard.
Yeah.
It has been. And
Yeah.
that's why,
Yeah.
yeah, it just quickly summary. That's why I don't like to use loss magnitude or single loss expectancy by itself. It distorts because if you don't factor in the frequency, there's no way to normalize, right? I could have, but what I've heard on the flip side of that is, help me understand, is it a likelihood issue or is it an impact issue that is driving the ALE, like how the ALE moves, which is interesting because they want to know, well, which axis is actually creating the bigger component into the calculation. So that's always an interesting view too.
Yeah, and one of the ways this has helped us getting to the OKR discussion, right? So if you think about this, if I have a map that says, all right, here on the Y is telling me how high of a risk this is. So telling me if it happens, how bad is this going to be and how likely do we think? There's a calculation that goes into it. And then my X, the farther away, I get, that means I'm not very mature at this. So it still means upper right is bad, high risk, and I'm not good at it. So then I start looking at, all right, I can lay all my risks out on my heat map and I can say, okay, where do I have funding and staffing available today to address these things? What are the dependencies between them, right? And so then I could start to say, well, I think that the most important things that I need to move definitely are in the upper right, but oh, by the way, the staffing that I have can really take away something that's in the middle. And so you start to bring a reality to what it is that you're able to accomplish in your objectives and key results. And you can start to create targets. So I could say, hey, if I'm in the upper right now, I don't think I'm going to get in lower left, but I want to get somewhere closer to the middle, right? And so what can I do to get there? So we use our heat map along with the reality of capabilities and funding that we have to say, these are the top things that we're going to do this year and where we're going to go. It also gives us targets. So we could say, all right, I could go back to my scoring on a risk. Maybe it's around data governance. And I could say, well, I'm really bad in these 3 areas. So if my OKRs address these 3 things, I think this is what my new score will be. And this is how my dot is going to move on that heat map.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a nice structured way.
So, Summer, does the business's ability to actually handle the risk or mitigation of the risk? I'm thinking the political side of this. You may look at a risk and say, this is a political hot potato. This is probably going to take me 6 months just to influence. So maybe it's not worth putting my financial or my staff focus on right now until I can go beat down some roadblocks. Does that play any role in your decision on when to mitigate risk?
Absolutely. It 100% does. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't make the dot go away. It doesn't make the risk go away. And it keeps it there. And then you can even say asterisks. Yep. By the way, I can't move that. I actually had this exact example last year where I had some vulnerabilities that I really needed to address, but I didn't have, it was on a special pieces of hardware and I didn't have the ability to do the patching on them.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to be able to address those vulnerabilities if I didn't have a patching capability. That risk stayed out there and it stayed with an asterisk that said, until these other 3 things are accomplished, that risk is not moving.
Yeah.
Now you can put some controlling factors in place, but frankly, it could just as easily have been, hey, there's a piece of regulation that's in the way. Or I'm not going to do this until, the Texas legislature votes on this, right? And so you could, or what we'll do is we're going to try to mitigate that by getting involved in an industry group that's part of lobbying. So yes, the reality definitely comes into play in saying what I am going to address and what I'm not.
Yeah, and there's so many instances of that. There's technical debt that the company doesn't want to invest in mitigating the technical debt. I've seen instances
Yeah.
where, that technical debt is backed by client revenue because they need said system or data or whatever the case may be, because it drives a ton of revenue into the business. They don't want to eliminate the technical debt. So there's always going to be those instances where you have the asterisk. I love that. It's here.
Yeah.
Everybody see it, but these are the reasons why we can't do anything about it right now.
That's definitely part of the do hard piece, though, right? Because I know a lot of organizations that when we talk about maturity, they don't have the maturity to understand that. And you would think the rest of the business would generally know about that from their risks. But I've found, and I can think of specific instances, either my own past life or colleagues, other CISOs that have seen this, where the perception is, well, we have to do something about the risk, but we don't want to do something. We'll just take it off the graph. And it's like, no, it stays on the risk register. It's okay to accept it, right? It's okay to accept it and then have a follow-up timeline, right? And say, okay, if it's a critical, we're not going to let it extend past this time period before we revisit it, right? And you have to keep that on. That's part of the whole governance structure. But so frequently that's missed.
Yeah. And nobody likes it there. Nobody wants to be able to walk. You walk in quarter after quarter and say, well, this hasn't changed, and here's why. But it's important to recognize that. And
therein lies the point of keeping it on the list, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, the positioning is, though, I hate seeing this on the list just as much as the rest of you.
Yeah.
But we can't bury our heads in the sand. It exists.
Right.
We can't bury our heads. And practically speaking, maybe something else in another area is more important. It's more important to do this marketing activity, or it's more important to do, something in the engineering area and accept this. And that's where the business speak comes in. And you can really show.
That discussion and the documentation around that discussion is what's really helpful if you have an incident after that. Right? Because you want to be able to go back and say, hey, it wasn't that we were, especially for CISO and personal liability, you don't want to say, well, we just didn't show it to anybody. You want to say, hey, look, we brought this up, we documented it, the business had, a risk acceptance discussion, and we agreed that this was how we were going to handle this for a business reason, which is justified. And, like auditors, regulators, there are things they expect you to do, but there's also an understanding that there's a way to handle it. And it's not always patch it, remediate, turn it off. Sometimes it's do something for a certain period of time with a goal to a future state that you're going to fix that.
Absolutely. And that can be a part of your 3-year planning. The other thing I like about the approach this way is it really spurs creative thinking with your team. Because, if you go back and say, well, hey, we're not going to have the funding to buy this tool, or we don't have XYZ. Sometimes people come up with really creative solutions that you haven't thought of before. Whereas if you were just given the money to do it, you would have done it the same old way that everyone else has. And so there's a level of creativity and really being innovative that I think comes into play when you have those challenges.
I think so. You bring up an interesting thing when you talk about communicating this out and having discussions about it, is that what I've also found is if you're talking this through around the OKR discussion and you're saying, hey, here's why the business is making this decision to do X with the team and we're not going to fix it. Yeah. It can mitigate some of the feelings on the team sometimes of, man, they just don't want to invest in security. They don't want to do the right thing. Well, no, this is why we're doing it, because there's a business driver to this, and this is the intended outcome we're looking for. And so open your mind up to other ways of thinking how to address things. Again, it's not always the patch or, turning something off.
Yeah, that transparency, Ben, is super important, right? Organizations and teams need to know that there are competing priorities in business, and that the executive team is going to make decisions on prioritization of different items. We can't afford to do it all, right? So being able to have that candid conversation with the team is important, because many times when you keep a team in the dark, they make their own perceptions of what's happening. I like the transparency.
And as the leader,
style.
You're setting the tone.
That's
you
right.
have to set the right tone.
That's right. Exactly it.
I think that transparency also builds trust within the company, because if you don't have that transparency and you don't show the team that, this is a risk that we have identified, it's a risk that we can't address in this way right now, they don't walk away thinking you're stupid, that you haven't even recognized it.
Yeah.
They might not agree. They might think, wow, this is way more important than what we're actually spending money on. But it does show that you've at least considered it and you've talked about it. And I think that builds credibility for the leadership team.
But on that same point, if you're bringing out all the business reasons around that risk, again, they at the end of the day, they still might not agree with you, right? But I think a lot of people never get in the security org, never get to see that part of the business. And so they think, yeah, they're just stupid. They're not fixing it, right? Where they don't realize, there's a trade-off here, and our bonus depends upon that and the outcome of the company and the success and, our value within the market. Like all that matters, and figuring out how to transparently show that is really, really important.
Yeah, they think security is not a priority. When staff think security is not a priority, they're looking for the next place.
That's right.
Right.
Not all vulnerabilities are the same. A critical vulnerability on a marketing laptop isn't the same risk as a critical vulnerability on a production server accessed by a domain admin missing EDR. Sevco Security shows you these interconnected risks. Sevco centralizes intelligence on all your devices, identities, software, vulnerabilities, and security controls, enriching them with threat intelligence and business context in real time, so your security team has exactly what it needs to effectively prioritize and remediate vulnerabilities based on the unique requirements of your business. Think of it as a to-do list for risks, but less annoying. Find a smarter way to manage exposures. Visit securityweekly.com/Sevco today. Now, I've seen variations of this kind of almost in the reverse side. So let me play this out for a second. One of the trends I saw right after the SEC came out with some of the cybersecurity reporting requirements is organizations were trying to figure out how to de-scope certain risks because they didn't want them to be material, so they didn't have to report against them, right? No, I'm serious. And so I started to see a trend in some of the risk discussions around aligning risks to goals and objectives, and only make sure that those risks were reported up to the board from a transparency perspective, right? Now I can see aspects of that, but that goes counterintuitive to the transparency discussion we just had, is that we're not as transparent if we're removing risks out of the goal alignment because the board doesn't want to know about it because they want to be able to stick their head in the sand, right?
Plausible deniability.
Exactly. But that was a trend I was seeing. I'm just curious, like, I know it's not the right thing, but when I think about alignment is important from that perspective, so you know what you're reporting to the board, because maybe the board doesn't care about the risks, but that doesn't mean you hide them from the rest of the organization. I think that's a balancing act, isn't it?
I think it is. That's a complete balancing act, and it's also that determination of materiality, right? But you're right. The internal discussion, you're always going to have things that you can't fully explain to the staff. But the internal discussion around, these are risks that we've recognized and these are the things that we're doing, the more transparent you can be, the more bought in you're going to have your staff. And you're going to have engagement because they're going to say, oh, wow, we really are at least paying attention. Like Ben said, you might not agree with the prioritization, but at least there's that openness around what the plan is.
Well, and you brought up on the front at the very beginning of the conversation the whole concept of bringing in the other execs, right? Agreeing what the categories are, agreeing what the formulas look like, what the metrics, like the scoring. If you kind of set that tone, again, you may decide at this level, it's got to exceed this level of risk before we raise it to the board. But here's how we're going to list it on the register, and here's how we're going to account for it. Here's how we're going to accept risks. Here's how we're going to put insurance towards risks, right? Like all those things, having that agreement on the register, I think gets away from some of that problem, but it is a very fine line. I think every CISO who's been around for a little while remembers FUD, right? Vendors trying to sell on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I think we get involved in that sometimes internally as well, like scaring people into doing the right stuff. And that doesn't work. You've got to bring them along on the journey and have them really buy into, this is a problem, and let's find a joint way to agree to work on addressing it.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you report this back up, right? I've seen different ways to report this, and I'm curious what's the most effective way. So you talked about the 9 categories, and under the 9 categories, you have your different scenarios. I call them scenarios, right? The different risks that roll to the category. Do you align the category to a set of company goals and objectives? Do you map the individual risks under those like how do you visualize this, right? You got to make it easy, I think, for people at the executive level to understand it from a, I always talk about the CFO, the CEO, and the board, right? Like how best to align those. What does that graphic look like? What does that visual look like?
So you're right. It can get really, really complex. And so the explanation is a little more complex than what the visual is. But once you understand what the risk categories are and what your risks are, that's when you start to build your plan, right? Again, so you align it with your resources, your staffing, your time, the funding that you have, and you say, okay, what can we do? Let's make those our objectives. How are we going to measure our progress to those objectives? Then it comes down to actual measures, right? What am I actually looking at in terms of, is my cybersecurity program getting better, or whatever program you're measuring? And there are levels of measures. We have a metrics catalog. Okay, and the metrics catalog looks at what do we need to look at on an everyday basis, and what do the individual task leads need to look at. And so there's a metric, there's a definition of it, there's a cadence of reporting, there's a calculation, there's a source of data. Like we really build out a full catalog. And then we have a level for cybersecurity management. So, you have the task leads, then it's what's being reported to management, what's going to senior leadership in the company, and then what's going to the C-suite and board. And they build to each other, but not entirely, right? So it's not like every metric at the bottom gets reported up or is part of a calculation. But we really have been thinking through what matters in showing the ELT, the executive leadership team, the C-suite, what matters that the managers need to know. And so that's the alignment of what we're reporting up. Those things, absolutely, the objectives and key results of what we're doing line up directly with corporate objectives. So your company does need to say, over the course of the next 12 months, these are the top 5 things we want to achieve. And then you should be aligning your objectives based on the risks to getting to those, to those corporate level objectives. So it's it all ties together.
So Summer, you are putting timelines to those as well, right? Dates, because I come from a 4 disciplines of execution, right, background, where unless you're saying I want to be X to Y by when, nothing's going to happen, because the can's just going to keep getting kicked down the road, right? So that 4 disciplines of execution is you need to put a hard date in the sand and do your best to manage to those dates. So you're actually giving out there publicly to the leadership team, to your staff, here's the date we want. We want to be X to Y by when.
And I would say your X to Y is really important too. So here's the other thing you have to make sure you incorporate. And this is why another part of it's so hard. You not only have to say, I want to have this complete by the end of 3rd quarter, you actually have to understand what the definition of complete is.
Yeah.
So for every single objective, then key result, you have to say, what does this mean? Does it mean that it's deployed? Does it mean that it's documented? Does it mean that you have an FAQ? And so that exactly what you've said, Ben, the success criteria have to be defined as well. So I'm going to do this, meeting this success criteria by this date.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this is how I'm going to measure.
I've seen a ton of projects fail, and I'm sure you have too, Summer, where somebody says, hey, we're going to deploy this technology. And they just say, deploy the technology. But what does that mean? Like 80%? 95%? If you're missing 2 systems, is it not fully deployed? Like what's the criteria around that where you're going to define success? And then I think, okay, how do you maintain that, right? Like because there's a lot of things where endpoint technology, you're going to deploy something, okay, you got there, but then how do you ensure that you're maintaining that excellence over time, that you don't have drift and find out now we're only at 80% 6 months from now, and we've completely missed the mark again?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the continuous measurement, right? Have to.
Yeah. It's the success of getting to the end of the actual task that you're doing, and what does that look like, and then when does that hand over to normal operations?
It's not just go live.
Yeah, it's not just go live. You got to train people, right? You have to train folks. I say all the time, look, if we deploy something, have we trained our service desk people on how to debug it, or when they get this? So, that success criteria has to define that. Potentially it's a lunch and learn with the help desk folks so that they can understand how to do this. And all of that has to be defined as well and should be a part of your key results.
So I want to run through maybe an example. It might not be 100% perfect, but I want to play this back for a
Our
second.
success criteria, Matt, is only 98% perfect. So
Right, agreed. Well, the example I'm going to use, you might even not say it's 98%. So let's use one of our favorite topics around security awareness and training, right? Mm-hmm. Which influences social engineering and human error risk, potentially, which I can align back to maybe some key goals and objectives, right? So if I think about this, I've got a security awareness and training metric that I want to get monthly training completions at 85%, because that can help mitigate certain social engineering and human error potential risks that I can align back to a setup, maybe a goal around customer satisfaction. So I don't know. I'm making this up on the fly. Is that roughly the structure that you kind of build, or what else is in there? Like, I'm just trying to help people kind of understand it in one use case.
It is. So I actually have a security awareness and training OKR this year. And it has to do with, number one, having a roadmap defined for what we want to achieve. Then it dives into specific metrics around how frequently are we doing phishing exercises? What are we doing in terms of learning campaigns? And so we go very, very specific into, we would like to have, we determined we were doing quarterly phishing exercises instead of monthly, because we wanted to build in some different styles of learning. And so, what we lay out are super specific things that we have to achieve by certain dates. And what do those things mean? So it could be, 2 exercises that we send out that are fun, like a crossword puzzle, or, one of the styles of things that we might do from another learning activity, a Jeopardy game, whatever that might be. And so, and then there's also the compliance. So what you mentioned, we send out training and we want to make sure that we have X% by a certain time. All of that being defined out with the date that it needs to be completed, and then you begin tracking against it. And you actually have to do things like, we go very, very specific. So developing the campaigns, getting them approved, getting them documented, implementing them. Then there's the analysis and measuring of them. Then you want to say, what did I actually achieve from this? What is actually that I want to get? It's not the checkbox. That's the training isn't the end goal. The end goal is fewer incidents, fewer complaints. And so then you think about, all right, let's start measuring, those types of things. And that's actually really what you want to get to, which is, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is better security.
Fewer compromised credentials sitting in the dark web.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So Summer, we've talked a ton about what I would call the more traditional side of cybersecurity, right? We've talked about those type of objectives. What in my career, I realized quickly, if I can't show the CEO and the CFO how security is helping move the needle for the company, I'm not going to get the seat at the table that I'm looking for. So my question to you is more of the business type of objectives. How have you aligned to those? So things that I did was I aligned security to revenue growth, customer acquisition and retention, operational efficiency. That's a big one. I mean, the security team had a 30,000-foot view of the entirety of the organization, and we saw where there were overlapping technologies that we could consolidate. Bring that to the table to the CFO, right? So those are some of the objectives that I put in place, were more of the traditional business objectives. So I had some that showed the CEO and the CFO we actually help move the needle here and the things that you care about.
Yes. You're exactly right. So from my standpoint, from a self-driving car company, trucking company, we're really looking at moving the needle from the product side. So my goals are really focused around making the product secure. And it's really even just table stakes to get in, but that's moving the needle. But you're exactly right when you think about other things that you can do. And I've done this from the IT side. I would give myself a target by working with my enterprise apps team to say, all right, let's see how can we move the needle on saving costs with various, one of the things that we've done is use some of our tooling to determine when we can go reclaim licenses. And so we would say X amount of savings that we want to have from an enterprise licensing standpoint, or we are going to consolidate apps. And then you go work with the business side and say, look, together we could save the company X tens of thousands of dollars if you move from Smartsheet to Project or vice versa. And we consolidate on a tool set that we're going to use. So you try to find those wins. You have to win people over and get them to get on board and give them some of the credit. But that's exactly right. There's going to be the business as usual. And then there's going to be the improving the bottom line. And then there could be actually improving the product or service that you're providing.
Yeah, so many times we just think in our own lane, where if we want to elevate ourselves up to be business executives, we need to be thinking like business executives within the organization.
Yeah.
And making those recommendations that may not be in our traditional lane.
Yeah. And sometimes making it more painful for ourselves.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. There's nothing more painful than when I go to my teams and I'm like, hey, folks, guess what? We promised to find $1 million in license savings over the next, 3 years. And they're like, oh, we did? And I'm like, we sure did.
The royal we there.
Microsoft E5.
You all raised your hands. You just didn't know it.
But it actually, and then you make it fun, right? It's like now the team is like, guess what? We found savings here and we were able to do a cost avoidance there. And it becomes part of the gamification of those goals as well. And you celebrate those wins, even the small wins.
I have one last question for you on this topic. How are you tracking all this? Is it spreadsheets and...
I'll be honest. So we do have a tool called O-Board that we use for objectives that aligns individual objectives down to like my personal goals line up through the OKRs and through the corporate objectives. From the risk management side, we're a small company and we're doing it in spreadsheets right now. And frankly, that's because I want to get really good at what we're doing before I select the tool. Because I don't want the tool to drive how I do things. Yeah. I want the tool to enhance what I'm doing, make things easier, make some improvements. And I have found just throughout my years, especially in all the years I worked in the CERT program at Carnegie Mellon, working with different government agencies, the misery of being forced into a large GRC program or a large goals program. And I thought, I'm not going to do that. Let's really get good at what we need to get good at and have a tool enhance it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some pretty decent OKR tracking tools, which are good to kind of report the results, but then it's all the other stuff that you have to track, right? And I hear you, right? Spreadsheets are easy to a certain point, but then at some point, scalability becomes an issue with the spreadsheet. So.
Yeah, we'll get there. I mean, we'll definitely get to that point. We're already starting to see it where, there's some automation of some feeds that we have. We're using some tooling for that, like feeding into Tableau, feeding into various places. But, I don't need a million vendors calling me, but we will be, we'll be looking at some point for the tooling that will work best for us.
Yeah, no, I think you got to nail your own process first and then figure out how best to implement it at scale. Yeah, for sure. Jason, Ben, any additional questions for Summer? This is a great topic. By the way.
Good to go. This is awesome.
Conversation.
Thanks, Summer.
Yeah. This is fun. This is my passion because I think it brings the people together, right? And that's an exciting part of the job.
That's the do hard part it sometimes is bringing all those people together and getting you all to agree, which is why we do these segments. Some are always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. We hope you enjoy RSA Conference. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.